Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing the 13 days of Craftoween day 5. So we've opened up 1 to 4 until today. They're all in the same playlist. So if you haven't seen those videos, you can check them out in the same playlist. So today is day 5. And like I mentioned, they come in these little packages with these folders. So the die is completely hidden. There's no spoilers on the front. So today we have this adorable little spider with the top hat. So the first thing I need to do is do a bunch of die cutting. I'm going to do that off screen. These dies layer together really easily, and I love the fact that the coordinating stamp set has perfect sentiments to go with each one of these dies. So to add just a little bit more interest to this die cut, I die cut the black part of the spider out of velvet cardstock. Now it comes as velvet adhesive cardstock, so I like to put it just on some scrap cardstock before I die cut it, just making it easier to assemble the different pieces together. There's 3 layers to the body of the spider. I only use that velvet adhesive cardstock on the top layer as well as the legs. I also wanted to add just a little bit of shine, so I'm using some of the mirror metallic cardstock from the Onyx Treasured cardstock pack. So we have a few different blacks that have different textures to them, just giving it a little bit more interest, a little bit more texture, and it also catches the light a little bit nicer when you're tilting the card in the light or the finished card into the light. So as I'm layering these pieces together, I'm gluing them together with some Barely Art glue. I have it in a fine line bottle, so it works perfectly for all these tiny little die cuts, as well as layering my cards themselves together. I put an acrylic block on my die cuts while they're drying, just to hold everything nice and flat, frees up my hands to work on other things as well. So I always like to assemble my die cut elements together and have that completely dry before I add them to my card background. That way, if by chance I change my mind to the position or whatnot, I can easily do that. I can also lay that die cut element on my background and see exactly where I think it should go. Because we have a spider die cut, I thought this spider web background press plate would make the perfect background to go behind it. So I'm putting that in my BetterPress system. I'm going to stamp with VersaMark ink and then emboss it with silver embossing powder. So we have some nice silver spider web lines, and then I'm going to do some ink blending on that background. I'm just doing this on Hammermill Cardstock. This will work on whatever cardstock you like. I tend to have it at hand, and I always love doing my ink blending on it because it blends so nicely. So I start off with a little bit of embossing powder tool on it once I have it taped to the clear plate of my BetterPress. Then I ink up my press plate with that VersaMark ink. You can see that I did not clean my plate off very well after the last time I used it, but that's okay. It'll still work just fine. The silver embossing powder is going to cover any of the ink transfer. There's a little bit, you'll see it once I pull it out of my die cutting machine. So I put the clear plate onto the base of the BetterPress, put it through my Platinum 6 machine for that pressure to press that image into the cardstock. And then once I have it off of there, I'm going to add that silver embossing powder. Now, anytime I'm using press plate images, I'd like to use super fine embossing powder when possible, especially for something like this and especially for sentiments. For really fine lines, I find that the super fine embossing powder really gets into those lines a lot easier than regular embossing powder. So I have a little scrap piece of paper underneath there. I pour the embossing powder over top of it. Any of that excess gets caught on the scrap paper, and then I can put it right back into the jar, so there's absolutely no waste to it. Then I use my embossing tool to melt that powder, and it goes from a matte granular look to a nice shiny glossy silver look. Perfect for spider webs. Another option here would be to use some white embossing powder or even clear embossing powder if you wanted. Obviously, you would need to make sure that your press plate was clean and not leave it dirty like I had from the last time. But I really like the look of silver spider webs. I'm not really sure why, but that's the look that I was going for today. So the piece of Hammermill cardstock that I used here is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches. I'm going to trim that down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches after I'm done my embossing, but before I do my ink blending. Anytime I'm ink blending, there's a little bit of heavier ink around the edges, and I really like the look of that. It just kind of frames it in a little bit. So I want to utilize that and trim my cardstock off before adding the ink to that background. Now I'm using the spider web background press plate here, but you could easily use a stamped spider web for this background. You could also use a spider web die cut. That would look great as well. Anything that would work to go with the spider. And if you don't have any of those, you could even use a silver gel pen and draw spider webs. They don't really need to come in a certain shape or size, so you can get really creative with that. So with my embossing done, I'm trimming this down to 4 inches by 5¼ inches, as I said before. And then I'm going to ink blend that background with a combination of Hickory Smoke and Villainous Potion Distress ink. Now that Villainous Potion is going to coordinate nicely with the violet cardstock that I used to die cut the hat for the spider. But if you chose a different cardstock for the spider hat, you could easily coordinate your colors to go with that. I also have a piece of violet cardstock here that I'm trimming to 4¼ inches by 5�3/8 inches to do as my mat around my piece here. So I'm going to start off with that Hickory Smoke Distress ink, and just like before, I've mentioned it a few times, I am kind of deliberately blotchy when I do my ink blending, especially for something like this. I want it to look kind of misty, hazy, foggy in the background of these spider webs, but I don't want it to be completely even. If I wanted it to be completely even in color, I would just use colored cardstock. And if you like the even color of a background, then absolutely substitute that Hammermill cardstock for some solid cardstock and it will work perfectly. This inking in the background here is going to bring out the silver of those embossed spider webs, especially that Villainous Potion, because it's such a dark color. It really brings that out, and I love the look of those spider webs against that background there. So with my background done, I'm ready to stamp and emboss my sentiment. Now, obviously, because I have a press plate background here, it's embossed all the way around or all over that background. I'm not going to be able to stamp a sentiment right on there. And I wanted my sentiment to be on the front of the card rather than on the inside, especially because that spider only takes a certain amount of the space of the front of the card, so that sentiment is going to fill up some of the area. So I have some matte silver cardstock here. This is from the Silver Treasured Cardstock pack, and I'm going to stamp and emboss my sentiment on that. I'm going to emboss it with black cardstock so it coordinates with the black of the spider. I stamp with some VersaMark ink using my Misty stamping tool so that I can stamp it a couple times, make sure that I have a nice, clear, crisp stamping of that sentiment. Put on some black embossing powder and then heat emboss that. Now you can tell when I heat emboss that sentiment, it curves my cardstock. It especially does that with specialty cardstocks because they're coated on one side. So it wants to curl, but I can easily flatten that for assembling my card. So it's not an issue having that curl. The other thing is because I use that acrylic block to hold everything down nice and flat while everything is drying, that'll keep it nice and flat once I am gluing it to the front of my card. So with my sentiment done, I can start assembling the background of my card. So I'm going to put down that violet cardstock piece first, making sure that it's nice and centered on my A2 card base, and then I can add that spider web background. And like I said before, I've done this in purple and gray for the background, but you can do whatever colors you want. You can do a multiple different colors if you want. You can even do kind of an ombre background behind those spider webs. I think multiple colors just look a little bit, like I said, a little bit more visually interesting. So with those background pieces done on my card and drying, I can trim down my sentiment. Now this sentiment, none of the sentiments in this set have dies to go with them. So they do either need to be stamped directly onto your card or trimmed down. You could fussy cut around them if you wanted it to go closer around each one of the sentiments, but I am opting here to just do kind of a sentiment strip at the bottom of the card. Again, it's going to also take up a little bit more of that card front and fill it in just a tiny little bit more. So I trim that down, trim the length of it down so it's the same length as my spiderweb background, which is 4 inches. The width of it doesn't matter. It just depends on which sentiment you use, and I try to trim it, I want to say like 1/8 of an inch from that sentiment, and I like it to be even on both sides. So I can glue that sentiment down and then I can glue down my spider. However, I wanted to add just a little silver spider web line or whatever for that spider to be hanging from. You could use a silver gel pen, but I thought that was just going to get hidden amongst the embossed spider webs. So I opted to take that silver cardstock that I had used for my sentiment, just trim a really thin line of it, and then add some glue to it, glue it to that base of the card. My cardstock is longer than it needs to be. That way I can put it down or high enough or as much as I want to get the look that I'm wanting. That extra little piece that is hanging off the edge is not glued down. So as soon as the rest of it has started to set a little bit, I can trim that down so it looks like it was the right size to begin with. Then I can glue my spider on there. That way I have it positioned perfectly on that little web. And by using the silver cardstock for that web, it just pops off of that page just a little bit more and looks a little bit more intentional. You wouldn't get that look from using a silver gel pen, but if that's all you have, then it would work in a pinch. So once that's dry, I thought it would be fun to give the spider some nice glossy eyes. So I add some glossy accents to it and let that dry completely. And I'll tell you right now, it didn't work properly because that velvet cardstock just really absorbed the glossy accents. So there's two different options that you could do here. You could just use regular cardstock for the top of the spider and that wouldn't happen. You could use regular cardstock, do the glossy accents, and then put some velvet adhesive cardstock over top of it afterwards to make the eyes glossy but not have the velvet adhesive absorb it. What I end up doing to fix it is I take that top hat off, I cut another piece of velvet adhesive cardstock to glue on the top, which is the alternative of doing it from the beginning with regular cardstock and then putting that velvet adhesive over top afterwards. A third option would be to just use googly eyes. They come in a bunch of different sizes and it would add just a different interactive element to your card as well. So it just really depends on the look that you're going for, the final result. Obviously, if you just use googly eyes, then you don't need all 3 layers to that spider body. You could just do one of the layers, then do your velvet adhesive cardstock over top, and then add those googly eyes to those open holes there. And it would also be just a fun way just for that interactive element, like I said. Thank you so much for joining me for day 5 of the 13 days of Craftoween. I will see you tomorrow for day 6.